World of Warcraft has seen some very dark times. Content droughts, design fiascos, scandals, systems too complex for their own good, and radio silence as community engagement hits an all-time low. And now Final Fantasy XIV and other competitors are closing in. But I don't think this has to be the end of the story for World of Warcraft. What World of Warcraft needs is simpler systems, more content, better community engagement so that the dev teams know what will get players excited to pick up World of Warcraft again. To that end, I have invented a system of my own, a simple system that gives players huge amounts of customization, that lets developers add awesome and useful abilities without fear of spellbar bloat, giving players the ability to upgrade 3 of their spells to be something new. I'm cooking up concepts for 7 of these upgrade spells for every spec. Some of them are returning favorites, some of them are brand new. Either way, Blizzard has my express permission to use every concept I post about in these videos in the comments or on the forums. And if the Blizzard developers are too pressed for time to engage with the community, then I will. I'll get the feedback on this concept, and even if they don't take a single one of my ideas, they'll know what the players want, and most importantly, why. And they can use that to make the game better, because I want this game better. I want WoW to last another decade. You know what's funny? I've mained a Holy Paladin since the summer of 2005, and back in vanilla, Paladins and Shaman were made to mirror each other, and so much has happened since then. Shaman and Paladins are nothing alike these days. Back during vanilla, as a Paladin, I really envied your shock spells, Lightning Bolt, Chain Heal, and Storm Strike. Heck, I still wish Blizzard would unprune Holy Radiance and Denounce so I'd have a multi-target heal and a ranged damage ability, both with no cooldown. But, class design has gotten a lot better since vanilla for just about everyone. Though there is room for improvement. I wouldn't be doing Project Decade if there wasn't. Of course, I understand that not having played a Shaman or a class that's anything like what Shaman are these days, I will make mistakes with my designs. And some mistakes will be more obvious than others, and some more cringe than others. But I fully intend to receive feedback on the mistakes I've made and correct them as players provide feedback, thus turning the cringe into nothing but a bad memory. So without further ado, let's get going so you can help me sort the useful stuff out from the mistakes. First up is Magma Shock, an upgrade for Earth Shock that deals Firestorm damage and has a damage over time component that absorbs Flame Shock's remaining damage if Flame Shock is on the target, and then Flame Shock can stack with Lava Shock's damage over time. This costs more Maelstrom than Earth Shock would. Casting Magma Shock on a target that already has Magma Shock active banks the original Magma Shock's remaining damage and adds it to the new Magma Shock's damage, including any Flame Shock damage over time remaining on the target. Second, we have Firestorm Shock, an upgrade for Flame Shock that deals area of effect damage to all enemies near your main target as Firestorm damage, and applies the Flame Shock debuff to all nearby targets at 60% duration. Third, Lightning Bolt Volley, an upgrade for Chain Lightning. It hits more targets and generates more Maelstrom, but deals slightly less damage per target than Chain Lightning would deal to its primary target. Next, we have Elemental Geyser, an upgrade for Earthquake that deals elemental damage instantly to multiple targets, deals slightly less damage overall than Earthquake, assuming the targets would stay in Earthquake's area of effect, and costs less Maelstrom. Fifth, we have Rockbiter, an upgrade for Primal Strike. This hurls your weapon at the target, dealing nature damage to the target, and hitting the target with whatever effect your weapon has on it, for example, Flame Tongue. This generates Maelstrom and has a longer cooldown. Next we have Earth Bolt, an upgrade for Lava Burst. It deals nature damage and is no longer guaranteed to crit when Flame Shock is on the target. Instead, if Flame Shock is on the target, Earth Bolt will chain to an additional target. The final upgrade in the spread is Frostmend. This is an upgrade for Healing Surge that generates Maelstrom when you use it to heal a target. Now for the thinking. I was hoping to provide some interesting trade-offs with these upgrades. Almost everything I had at first was modifying the damage for Maelstrom in one way or another, and a lot of that is still here. In fact, that covers the thinking for Geyser and Lightning Bolt Volley Mostly. Lightning Bolt Volley is also intended to just plain look cool, albeit a different kind of cool than Chain Lightning. Abilities that look cool are honestly half the appeal of upgrades. Heck, Earth Bolt is a similar story. It'll add some visual variety. Of course, the question of whether Chain Lightning or Lightning Bolt Volley is more optimal in a given fight depends on the number of targets, but ultimately either one can have a place in gameplay. Or at least, that's what I was aiming for. Earth Bolt was originally going to be a resource trade-off. Instead of critting when Flame Shock was active, it would generate extra Maelstrom. Then I realized making it chain to another target was more interesting and actually a decent trade-off in multi-target situations, especially since it can keep chaining if more targets have Flame Shock on them. For a while I was upgrading Frost Shock to Water Shock, taking away the slow and making it generate more Maelstrom. But then I realized when I modified Earth Bolt into a multi-target thing that adding a way to quickly get Flame Shock damage over time onto multiple targets would be another exciting prospect for Elemental. That is where Firestorm Shock came from. The trade-off is less debuff duration for more debuffed targets. I'll pull Water Shock out of my back pocket if I run out of ideas, though. I should add that I came up with a different idea for upgrading Frost Shock for enhancement. Frostfire Shock, which deals less damage than Frost Shock, more damage than Flame Shock's upfront damage, and extends the duration of Flame Shock's damage over time. If I get feedback telling me to do so, I'll replace something else in here, like Elemental Geyser or Rockbiter with Frostfire Shock instead. I'd also like to note that I was worried that having too many Flame Shock damage over times at a time was a bad thing, and that it would create an imbalanced number of Lava Surge procs, so I added the caveat that caps the number of debuffs you can gain Lava Surge procs from. If I should have made it something else, if 5 was the wrong number, please do let me know. Frost Mend was meant to reward off-healing for DPSers. I'm not sure it's the best pick for upgrades, but I figured I should upgrade a heal or two when I'm making these for classes that have healing specs. It's meant to make healing less punishing by generating more resources when you do heal. A fun little fact about Frost Mend. Years ago, it was probably before Mists of Pandaria was announced, so still during Cataclysm, I tried to come up with some ideas for a Sea Witch hero class. A caster spec, a marksman spec, and a healer spec. I could do a whole rant on what the Sea Witch would have been like, but not in the middle of this video. I will say that at the time, healers had a pretty normalized basic single target healing kit, with each spec getting a slow efficient heal, a big medium efficiency heal, and a fast inefficient heal. I gave Sea Witches Recover for the slow heal, Hydromend for the big heal, and Frostmend for the fast heal. And now I'm plundering my concepts for Sea Witches for these upgrades. Anyhow, back to our regularly scheduled program. Rockbiter was intended to take two abilities that are technically in Elemental Spellbook, but that are currently useless, and make them useful. Flame Tongue and Primal Strike. Similar to Lava Burst, there's a cooldown on it, and it generates Maelstrom. I like doing things like this if I can, upgrading useless abilities to give them new life, like giving an upgrade for Shield Slam that Arms Warriors can actually use, or an upgrade for Smite that Shadow Priests can actually use, to name a few examples. I'm also sometimes reviving older abilities' names, if not their effects, with these upgrades. That's why I called this ability Rockbiter, even though its weapon-throwing effect is nothing like Rockbiter's old effect. I should probably talk about Magma Shock as well. If that were to go in, then the spec would change. It would be about consuming as many Flame Shocks as possible, since its damage over time would stack with Magma Shock. I suppose that might be an okay change to the feel of the spec, but I could use some feedback on this concept. I guess Magma Shock goes to show that even a single ability can completely change the feel of a spec and how a rotation works. No spell or ability or even passive really exists in a vacuum, and you need to take into account the entire kit when you design these things. I don't know whether having two Flame Shocks on a single target is overpowered or not. I could really use feedback on this whole concept. Not to mention on what could go wrong with it. I mean, if this de facto lets you have two Flame Shocks at once and then lets you have 2.2 Flame Shocks at once, then 2.4, etc., with ever-ramping damage the longer the fight lasts, then I may have created an overpowered monster. I want to make something that excites players, but I don't want to make things overpowered either. Now, when I started out with these upgrade concepts, I went ability by ability, not purpose by purpose, if you see what I mean. I asked myself, which abilities exist in this specs kit that I can give an upgrade to? And when I created upgrades based on which abilities I could upgrade, I often aimed for something that I thought looked or sounded cool. Almost always I wanted the upgraded ability to feel at least a little bit different from the original. Often I tried to create some kind of trade-off, making the upgrade situationally useful based on things like the number of targets affected or having a stronger effect with a longer cooldown, things like that. Rarely did I upgrade the same ability more than once for the same spec, but while I was putting together each spread of upgrades, what I didn't do, and what I probably should have done in retrospect, was to figure out what goals a player would have while they're looking at a list of upgrades, and then make sure upgrades exist in the spread that allow the player to pick upgrades that help them achieve those goals. In my next iteration, I plan to have that design goal in mind, to consider what the player wants to accomplish and how they could accomplish it with the upgrades. I strongly suspect that in this next iteration, there will be a lot more cases where I upgrade the same ability in 2 or more different ways. That will give players more options, and since that's going to be the goal with goal-oriented design, who knows? I might even have 3 different upgrades for the same ability in the end. However, I can do this much more effectively in an environment that has a great deal of feedback available, and that's where you come in. You have knowledge that comes from experience with these specs. I don't. I tried to do my research on Wowhead and Icy Veins for each spec, but inevitably there'll be things you know that I don't because you have experience that I don't have. You'll have more and better ideas than I could hope to have, and I know I need those, so please, let me know what you think of these upgrades and what better ideas you have for what to put in their places. So, even if each individual ability is exciting, I still have to ask the question, is the upgrade spread as a whole exciting? Well, if I were an Elemental Shaman player going into this with the goal of boosting my single target damage, there'd be Magma Shock and Rock Biter, and that would be it. Geyser and Lightning Bolt Volley wouldn't be useful for single targets, while Earth Bolt and Firestorm Shock would be downgrades. I'm toying with the idea of kicking out Elemental Geyser and replacing it with Frostfire Shock, which is that upgrade I cooked up for enhancement that prolongs the duration of Flame Shock, dealing less damage than Frost Shock but more than Flame Shock's initial damage. Please let me know what you think of that idea. As for multi-target, there's Elemental Geyser, which honestly was meant to be a trade-off that favored more mobile fights, Lightning Bolt Volley, Earth Bolt, and Firestorm Shock. That's 4, and you can only have 3 upgrades equipped at a time. Yeah, I'm really leaning in the direction of kicking out Elemental Geyser, though to be honest, it might be even wiser to kick out Lightning Bolt Volley, which is probably the last thing you'd expect me to say if you've seen my Holy Paladin, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Destruction Warlock, and Balanced Druid upgrade videos. One of the things that I really try to get into these upgrade spreads is Bolt Volley spells. Since I saw NPCs using Bolt Volley spells in Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, thought they were cool, and felt surprised when Blizzard never allowed players to use Bolt Volley spells. But the fact is, Chain Lightning is an iconic spell. Getting it off your spell bar rubs me the wrong way. I'd wanted to design Lightning Bolt Volley so that it's better if there are more targets than Chain Lightning can hit, and so that Chain Lightning is better if there are fewer targets. But you know what? I think I should be letting Elemental Shaman players decide what's good, what's bad, what's preferable, what I kick out, and what I keep. My tentative plan is to boot out Elemental Geyser in Iteration 2 and pull in Frostfire Shock, but feedback from players will take priority over what I think and what I like. Though before I close out, there is something I'd like to read you. To give you an idea of my thought process, let me read some notes I had from an earlier draft while I was puzzling through some of these nuances. Actually, I did some reflecting on this, and with Elemental and Frostfire Shock, there's a lot that I didn't consider. First of all, there's the fact that Flame Shock damage over time ticks can refresh the cooldown of Lava Burst, so you want the damage over time up at literally all times. Should Magma Shock's damage over time have the same effect? Will Magma Shock and Flame Shock on the same target at the same time double the chances of Lava Surge happening? And will extending the duration of Flame Shock with Frostfire Shock before absorbing it with Magma Shock actually increase overall DPS? I guess the answers to these questions could make the difference between underpowered, balanced, and overpowered, not to mention fun versus clunky. I probably should have thought those things through sooner. Considering that you want as much uptime as possible on Flame Shock for Lava Surge procs, I'd say that Magma Shock's damage over time should stack with Flame Shock for damage, but not for Lava Surge procs. At least, not on the same target at the same time. The duration of Magma Shock's damage over time will be the same as the duration on Flame Shock's damage, but the actual damage per second when Flame Shock gets absorbed into Magma Shock should be a bit higher because Magma Shock adds some damage to the bank when you cast it. That sounds fair and reasonable enough. It's not really that big a disruption of the rotation as far as I can tell, because all you'd gain from casting Flame Shock again on the target that already has Magma Shock would be an extra damage over time effect. And I suppose additional chances for the damage over time to stack with itself for the long haul as Magma Shock absorbs Flame Shock into itself. And thus ends those earlier notes. You can tell what I did about them in the first iteration. Again, I'm being very stream of consciousness-y about all of this because I know there's going to be times when I'm on the wrong track of thinking. And the more you know about what I'm thinking, the easier it'll be to spot when and where I went wrong, and the easier it'll be to get me onto the right track of thinking. Of course, I know Blizzard probably won't take many, or even any of these suggestions. Heck, they might even have something objectively better in store for us than the semi-borrowed power upgrade system that I've cooked up here. But knowing what gets players excited will be helpful to them even so. That is why I'm sacrificing so much of my free time and energy on Project Decade. And who knows, they might just need these ideas to get WoW going in the right direction. Heck, if this video series just gets the Blizzard developers into the habit of creating a blue post with the thinking in it that goes in depth enough for us to understand what they're doing and what their design goals are, then that would be a huge step forward. Even saying the thinking out loud is sometimes enough to get you a new perspective on what you're doing. Is it really what people want? Does it serve the purposes that it really should be serving in the end? Am I really doing something just to make a system look awesome instead of making the game overall better? What does it do for the fun factor? Am I making the mistake of prioritizing my design goals over the fun factor? Are my design goals the right design goals to have? Do my ideas match the spec's feel and flavor? Is it a net gain? Is it genuinely awesome? Things like that. Plus, we just plain need more communication from Blizzard. If Project Decade gets the development team into the habit of telling us the thinking for every change they make, then the whole project will have been worth it, even if they don't take a single suggestion. Again, if you see something you don't like bad trade-offs or something you know is counterproductive or useless, or if you've thought of an idea that's better or cooler or more useful than mine, then don't hesitate to let me know. The more details you can provide about why you don't like it and what makes one of my ideas counterproductive or useless, or about why your idea is cooler or more useful than mine, the better. One of the main goals of Project Decade is to give whoever's in charge of class design and player power systems a good idea what appeals to players and what will actually get them excited to get back to WoW again. And the more you can say about the wherefore and the why, the better. I fully intend to iterate on this project and make changes in response to feedback. I know I'm going to make mistakes. Heck, I've already seen mistakes in some of the things that I've done. But if those mistakes generate the kind of discussion that Blizzard needs to hear, so much the better. Blizzard needs to see player engagement, humility, and feedback actually making change in action so they can start doing what needs to be done to turn WoW around. It can be done and it should be done. World of Warcraft can last another decade. So keep the feedback coming, folks. There's one last thing. I began working on Project Decade videos back in July, and considering how many months it has taken, the fact that there are 36 different sets of feedback to curate and compile, and multitudes of decisions to make based on feedback received, ideas others have come up with, and how to weave everything together into a fun, functional, and exciting whole, I don't have a chance in the tramaculum of getting this done in any reasonable length of time unless I get volunteers to help me curate and compile the feedback I'm getting. If you're willing to help curate feedback, please let me know. If I get enough interest, I will set up a Discord server where we can coordinate everything. Thank you in advance for your feedback and support. Let's make World of Warcraft the best game that it can be.